The night Daniel asked me the question, nothing about our apartment felt unusual. The sink hummed softly as the dishwasher worked through its cycle, the kind of domestic noise you stop hearing once it becomes routine. Rain tapped against the balcony door in a patient, repetitive rhythm. Daniel sat on the couch beside me, one leg folded under the other, his attention divided between me and the muted television screen. We had been together long enough to share silence without fear. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. My name is Ethan, and for 3 years, Daniel had been my certainty. He was the person who remembered how I took my coffee and which nights I stayed awake too late with my thoughts. He was steady in a way that made life feel manageable. With Daniel, nothing burned too brightly, but nothing collapsed either. It was safe, predictable, earned. That evening, he leaned his head back against the couch and sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from the chest, not the lungs. I noticed it because lately I had been noticing everything a second too late. He glanced at me, his expression careful, as if he were rehearsing something he wasn't sure he should say. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. I nodded without looking at him. We both knew the answer would be yes. It always was. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Is there someone else you think about when you're not with me?" The words didn't arrive all at once. They landed slowly, one after another, like stones dropped into still water. The television continued playing, indifferent. The rain didn't stop. My body remained still, but something inside me shifted, subtle and irreversible. I turned to face him, searching for a hint of accusation or anger. There was none. Daniel wasn't confronting me, he was asking. That made it worse. His eyes held a tired honesty, the kind that comes from noticing changes but hoping to be wrong about them. I wanted to answer immediately. I wanted to say no and mean it, to restore the quiet balance we had been living inside. But the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. Not because I was confused, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I wasn't. My silence stretched longer than it should have. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. "I'm not accusing you," he added gently, as if offering me a way out. "I just feel distance. And I don't know where it's coming from." Distance. The word echoed in my head. I thought of how often my mind wandered lately, how certain conversations lingered longer than they should have. I thought of how I had started guarding my phone, not out of guilt exactly, but out of something more complicated. Anticipation, maybe, or recognition. "There's no one else," I said finally, choosing the safest truth I could find. It wasn't entirely a lie. It just wasn't complete. Daniel studied my face, measuring the space between my words and my expression. After a moment, he nodded. He didn't smile, but he didn't push either. That was Daniel's way. He trusted first, questioned later, and carried doubt quietly. We sat there for a while longer, the question hanging between us like humidity in the air. When he eventually stood to get ready for bed, he brushed his hand against my shoulder, a familiar gesture that suddenly felt fragile. "Good night," he said. "Good night," I replied, watching him disappear down the hallway. Left alone, I stared at the darkened screen of my phone on the coffee table. It didn't light up. It didn't need to. The truth was already awake inside me, restless and insistent. Daniel hadn't asked if I was cheating. He had asked if I was thinking. And that was the part one hadn't prepared an answer for. As the rain pressed harder against the glass, I realized that the question wasn't over just because the conversation was. It had only begun. I told myself the question lingered because Daniel had planted doubt, not because it belonged there. In the days that followed, I moved through our shared routines with practiced ease, answering texts, making dinner, laughing at the right moments. On the surface, nothing changed. Underneath, everything did. That was when Lucas began to take up more space in my thoughts than I was willing to admit. I had met Lucas months earlier through work, introduced in a room full of polite smiles and forgettable names. He was unassuming at first, quiet, observant, the kind of person who listened as if listening were an active choice. Our conversations started small, orbiting neutral topics like deadlines and shared frustrations. There was no spark I could point to, no moment that felt dangerous. That's how I justified it later. What set Lucas apart wasn't what he said, but how he asked. He didn't rush to fill silence. He let it settle, then stepped into it carefully, as though he understood that some truths needed space before they could breathe. When he asked how I was doing, it didn't feel like courtesy. It felt like curiosity. At first, I mentioned Daniel casually, the way you reference a fact you're proud of. Lucas never pried, never competed. He simply absorbed the information and continued talking to me as if I was still fully present, still entirely my own person. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. Our messages grew longer, then later. I noticed how I'd reread them before responding, editing my words not to impress him, but to be understood. I told myself that was harmless. Everyone wants to be understood. What I didn't tell myself, what I avoided noticing, was how often I checked my phone when Daniel wasn't looking. Or how I felt a quiet disappointment when the screen stayed dark. The secrecy wasn't about content, there was nothing explicit to hide. It was about ownership. Those conversations felt like they belonged to a part of me Daniel no longer reached. Lucas had a way of noticing the cracks I stepped over. One evening, after a long exchange about nothing that mattered and everything that did, he asked, "Do you ever feel like you're playing a version of yourself that people expect, instead of the one you actually are?" I stared at the question longer than necessary. It wasn't invasive. It was accurate. Daniel had never asked me that. Not because he didn't care, but because he assumed he already knew me. And maybe he did, just not the version that was changing. I began telling Lucas things I used to tell Daniel first. Small frustrations, passing thoughts, doubts I didn't want to unpack at home. Each confession felt minor on its own, easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern I refused to name. When Daniel reached for me at night, I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I listened to him talk about his day while part of my attention drifted elsewhere, replaying conversations that hadn't happened yet. The guilt arrived in fragments, never staying long enough to demand action. I told myself I was loyal because I hadn't crossed a physical line. I told myself that restraint counted for something. But loyalty isn't measured by what you don't do. It's measured by where you go when no one is watching. Lucas sensed the shift before I admitted it to myself. His messages became more cautious, his tone gentler, as if he were testing the ground beneath us. One night, he wrote, "I don't want to be a complication in someone else's life." I typed a response, erased it, typed again. I wanted to reassure him without revealing myself. In the end, I chose ambiguity. It was becoming my specialty. Daniel, meanwhile, grew quieter. He didn't accuse me. He adjusted. That was his mistake. The more space he gave me, the more I filled it with someone else. The turning point came quietly, the way most real ones do. Lucas and I were talking late, the conversation drifting without urgency, when he asked, "If everything stayed exactly the same, would that be enough for you?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because for the first time, the question wasn't about him or Daniel. It was about me, and I already knew the truth I was trying not to reach. The distance Daniel mentioned didn't announce itself loudly. It settled into our days like dust, thin and persistent, coating the spaces where intimacy used to live. We spoke, but less deeply. We touched, but without urgency. I told myself this was normal, that long relationships simply changed shape over time. The lie worked until it didn't. Daniel was the first to stop pretending. It happened on a quiet morning, the kind with no urgency to hide behind. We sat at the small kitchen table, coffee cooling between us. He watched me over the rim of his mug, his expression calm in a way that suggested resolve rather than peace. "You're here," he said carefully, "but you're also somewhere else." I opened my mouth to disagree, then closed it again. Denial felt insulting now. "I don't know how to reach you lately," Daniel continued. "And I don't want to compete with a ghost." The word landed harder than any accusation. A ghost implied absence and presence at the same time. Someone unseen, but felt. I felt exposed in a way that made my skin prickle. "There isn't anyone else," I said again, repeating the line I had practiced into safety. This time, it sounded hollow even to me. Daniel didn't argue. He nodded slowly, as if cataloging something painful for later. "I didn't ask if there was someone else," he replied. "I asked if there was someone you were holding space for." That was when the room seemed to shrink. Daniel had named the thing I refused to define. I stared down at the table, tracing a scratch in the wood with my thumb, buying time I didn't deserve. "I didn't plan this," I said finally. "I didn't mean for anything to happen. But something did," Daniel said. His voice wasn't raised. It was steadier than I expected. Maybe not in the way people usually mean. But it did. He stood and moved toward the sink, turning his back to me. That hurt more than if he had stayed. I wanted him to be angry. Anger could have absolved me. This quiet clarity did not. Later that day, Lucas messaged me. The timing felt cruelly precise, as if the universe were insisting I stop compartmentalizing my life. I think we should slow down, he wrote. I don't like the idea that I might be standing in the middle of something unfinished. I read the message several times. Lucas had always been careful, but now there was distance in his words, a boundary forming where invitation once lived. I realized, with a sharp ache, that I was losing him too. Not because I chose Daniel, but because I refused to choose at all. That evening, Daniel asked the question again. We were in the living room, the lights low, the television off. There was nowhere left to hide. He sat across from me, his hands folded, his posture composed in a way that suggested he had already grieved part of what he was about to lose. I need you to be honest with me, Daniel said. Even if it costs us. The weight of that sentence pressed down on my chest. Honesty, I realized, wasn't the act of telling the truth. It was the act of accepting the consequences of it. There is someone, I admitted. The words felt foreign in my mouth. Nothing physical, but I let myself go somewhere I shouldn't have. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself against a wave he had anticipated but hoped to avoid. When he opened them, there were tears there, unshed and stubborn. You don't have to touch someone to leave me, he said quietly. You just have to stop choosing me. I tried to explain. I talked about confusion, about timing, about loneliness I didn't know how to articulate. Every word sounded like an excuse the moment it left my lips. Daniel listened without interrupting, which somehow made it worse. When I finished, there was nothing left to say. I love you, Daniel said, standing. But I can't stay where I'm optional. He picked up his jacket, pausing at the door long enough for me to hope he might turn around. He didn't. After he left, the apartment felt unfamiliar, like a place I had borrowed rather than built. My phone buzzed once on the table. I didn't check it. For the first time, I understood the full cost of avoidance. And I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Time didn't heal what I had done. It clarified it. The days after Daniel left moved slowly, as if the world had decided to punish me with awareness. The apartment no longer felt like ours, it felt like evidence. Every object carried memory without comfort. His mug stayed on the counter untouched. His side of the bed remained empty, not dramatic, just final. Lucas was gone too. Not abruptly, not cruelly, just deliberately. After Daniel left, Lucas sent one last message. It was brief, careful, and kind in a way that hurt more than anger ever could. I think you need to be alone long enough to hear yourself clearly, he wrote. I don't want to be the reason you lose something you're still grieving. I didn't argue. For once, I didn't try to preserve something that wasn't mine to keep. I let the conversation end, understanding that what we had shared couldn't survive the truth that followed it. Alone, I began replaying everything. Not just what I did, but why I did it. I realized how often I had chosen comfort over courage, silence over clarity. I hadn't been confused about my feelings. I had been afraid of disrupting a life that looked right from the outside. Daniel had offered stability, and I had mistaken that for something unchanging. Lucas had offered curiosity, and I had mistaken that for escape. Somewhere between the two, I lost my sense of responsibility to honesty. I thought often about the question Daniel asked me that night on the couch. It echoed now, stripped of its softness, sharpened by hindsight. Is there someone else you think about when you're not with me? At the time, I had believed the danger lay in answering it. Now I understood the danger had been avoiding it. Weeks passed. I resisted the urge to reach out to Daniel, not because I didn't miss him, but because missing him didn't entitle me to interrupt his healing. Love, I was learning, did not grant permission to cause further harm. Still, I rehearsed conversations in my head. Not apologies meant to fix things, but truths I wished I had spoken sooner. I would tell him that emotional distance is not neutral, that it creates a vacuum someone else will eventually fill. I would tell him that loyalty isn't about boundaries you don't cross, it's about attention you don't redirect. Most of all, I would tell him that when he sensed something was wrong, he was right to trust himself. One evening, standing alone on the balcony as the city lights blurred into something indistinct, I admitted something I had avoided for months. I hadn't fallen out of love with Daniel before I drifted toward Lucas. I drifted because I was afraid to confront the quieter, harder work of staying fully present. I chose novelty over depth because depth demanded accountability. That realization didn't absolve me. It grounded me. Some stories end with reconciliation. Others end with transformation. Mine ended with understanding that came too late to save what mattered most. I don't know if Daniel ever forgave me. I know I forgave myself slowly, cautiously, not as an act of kindness, but as a commitment to do better. Forgiveness without change would have meant nothing. Now, when I think back to that night, the rain, the muted television, the way Daniel asked instead of accused, I understand how generous that moment was. He gave me a chance to meet honesty before it became loss. I didn't take it. If he was sitting across from me now, I know exactly what I would say. I wouldn't soften it. I wouldn't protect myself from it. Yes, I would answer. There was someone else in my thoughts. And I should have told you the moment I realized it. Because the truth doesn't destroy relationships. Avoiding it does. And that was the answer I wasn't ready to give, until it was the only one left.